Benvenuti, buonasera dal Museo del Vicino Oriente, Egitto e Mediterraneo. Oggi abbiamo un importante studioso straniero. We have a distinguished scholar from the American University of Beirut, il professor Hermann Genz. Sono molto lieto di annunciare la sua conferenza perché il professor Genz ha un lungo percorso nell'archeologia del Levante. Non sono poi tantissimi gli archeologi del Levante, quindi questo percorso passa partendo ovviamente dall'Università di Tübingen, che è la sede principale dove si è formato, passa però per molti siti importanti del Levante, quindi bisogna sicuramente citare Kibbet Zerkon, che è un sito dove la sua carriera è stata lanciata, è un sito molto importante e se non ci fosse stato il professor Genz forse avremmo saputo molto poco di questo sito, quindi lo dico in italiano così non mi scocco, è una cosa molto importante. Poi ovviamente ha partecipato agli scavi di Troia e di Bogaskei, quindi sono due siti fondamentali dell'Anatolia. La sua competenza ha spaziato dallo studio della produzione ceramiche alla stratigrafia, all'archeologia insediamentale, quindi diciamo un lungo cammino, però diciamo che questo cammino da un po' di anni, diciamo dagli ultimi decadi, si è concentrato in Libano, nello scavo occasionale che però si è rivelato invece una grande, importante scoperta di Tell Fadous. Scusate, questo non era previsto davvero, e quindi è di questo che ci parlerà stasera, ossia dei siti della costa del Libano settentrionale dove lui sta lavorando e ha lavorato. Io penso che lo possiamo ringraziare della sua disponibilità, del fatto di essere il nostro ospite, e penso che potremo avere da questo ritrovamento l'ennesima conferma dell'importanza della fascia costiera per la conoscenza di tutto il Levante, cioè di fenomeni storici, culturali, materiali e anche se vogliamo sociali che hanno riguardato tutta quanta la costa del Levante nell'età del bronzo e del ferro. Quindi thank you for your availability, for being here, and we are eager of listening about your discoveries in Tell Fadous and in general any other comments that you can deliver to us. Thank you very much. And
thank you very much for the kind introduction. Dear colleagues, friends, students, I'm glad that despite the lousy weather, a good number of you could make it here. As to my dismay, I discovered this is already the last official event of mine here during my stay. So allow me to maybe to take the time to say a few words. First of all, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to my hosting department here, the Departamento della Scienze dell'Antichità. Sorry, I practiced it before and now I messed it up. And especially, of course, my hosts, Professor Francis Pinnock and Professor Davide Nadali, but also Dr. Marsha D'Andrea, who really took care of me in an absolutely fantastic way. They made my stay here absolutely memorable. There is one thing that I noticed since I arrived 4 weeks ago. Literally every Italian colleague was a bit concerned and said, well, they were very apologetic and, yeah, are you really feeling well? Is everything okay? We're very sorry, this is not working well and this is not organized well. Why do you do that? You have nothing to be ashamed of. First of all, I have to say I'm not coming to you from Germany, but from Beirut, and Beirut is definitely more chaotic than most of you can imagine. Second of all, German efficiency is highly overrated. Berlin Airport, for instance. That says a lot. So, you have an absolutely wonderful university in one of the most remarkable cities of the world. You have an incredible number of high-ranking scholars in your ranks in our field, as far as I can judge. You have absolutely engaged and students. So I can say my 4 weeks here were the time of my life, so to say. And I feel both proud and humbled that even if only for a short period of time you accepted me in your ranks as a visiting professor. Okay, so, but I don't, as much as could be said about La Sapienza and Rome, this is not the topic of this evening, so we will turn to chaotic Lebanon instead, and I will talk about actually my first project that I conducted in Lebanon, the excavations at Tell Fadous, which started in 2004 and lasted till 2016. So just to illustrate the chaotic aspect, I was hired by AUB in 2004 and arrived there mid of August, 15th of August, I still remember that. On the 18th of August, I was already on the site with a system I didn't know, students I didn't know. So, but we made the best out of it. Okay. So, concerning the location of the site, so Fadous-Kfarabida is located on the Lebanese coast, as the photo, the starting photo showed. It's right on the coast, and one of the interesting things, it's located just 12 kilometers north of Byblos. Byblos is certainly, together with Roman Baalbek, one of the most famous excavation sites in Lebanon, but the excavations that were conducted in Byblos from 1922 to probably 1975, we don't even know exactly, are plagued by a lot of problems, stratigraphic problems, the way the reports were published, and so on. So for Byblos, we have absolutely spectacular finds, but more questions than answers. And so in comes Tell Fadous because of the close proximity to Byblos with, let's say, a modern excavation. We actually had hoped, and I hope I can show you we at least partly succeeded, that we can answer a number of questions in relation to Byblos. So here an old aerial photograph of the site from the 1950s, and there you actually see that the site, small, 1.5 hectares only, is still in relative good shape. There is the old coastal road which shaved away the western parts of the site. There is the railway line that shaved away the eastern part of the site. But in the 1950s it was still intact. Unfortunately, the site was only recognized as an archaeological site in 2004 by actually one of our graduate students, Kamal Badrashani. And the reason why we recognized it as a site was because it was in the process of being destroyed. So, situation again, the coastal road here, the railway line here, During the civil war in Lebanon, which lasted from 1975 to 1990, the site served as a tank emplacement for the Syrian army. So we got, let's say, unfortunately, some of the remains of this period, which we jokingly refer to as the Neo-Syrian period. So that inflicted considerable damage to the top of the site, and then just prior to 2004, the owners of the land started bulldozing away of the site, so about a third is lost forever. But these bulldozing operations created some about 8-meter high sections, and it was in these sections that our student Kamal Batrashani pulled out pottery and recognized the site as a rather important site. So when we started investigations in 2004, due to the limited size, 1.5 hectares is not really big, we were under the impression that we are dealing with a Bronze Age village there. And while a few villages have been excavated in the Levant, not enough are really researched to give an accurate picture of the backbone of the Bronze Age economy, which was animal husbandry and agriculture. So our initial goal was to investigate a Bronze Age village. We failed somehow in that aspect, but it was not a negative but a positive surprise. So here just a few images of how the site looks today. The first 2 years, in 2004 and 2005, we actually did not excavate at all, but we just studied these massive sections that were created by the bulldozer. So for a person who has slight vertigo, it was a bit scary to go up the 8-meter high scaffold, but nevertheless it was worth the effort. And so without actually removing much soil, besides just scraping a bit away from the profile, during the first 2 years, we already got a relatively good impression of what periods are present at the site, at least a general idea of the layout, and so on. So this is the work in progress. Here, the clean section, a section drawing. So from 2007 in 2006, for obvious reasons, we could not work. There was a slight war going on. So from 2007 onwards, we started excavations, first concentrating in 2 areas, the main area, Area 2, along these high sections, and another smaller area, Area 1, at the southern part of the site. In a second step from 2014 to 2016, we added 3 more areas to get an idea what was going on in other parts of the site. So our work during these years revealed that the site indeed has a quite, I would say, interest, for my part, and I hope some people agree, a rather interesting history of occupation, unlike many of the famous sites like Byblos, like Saida, like Tyre, and so on, where you have to deal with modern overburden, and then the Islamic period, and the Byzantines, and the Romans, and the Iron Age, and so on. Here we have about 2,000 years of occupation, starting in the Chalcolithic period and ending in the Middle Bronze Age. So, as one of my main research interests is the early Bronze Age, the period of urbanization, and so on and so forth, that made the site actually ideal for our research purposes, because we could dig immediately into the periods that interest us without having to deal with the later periods. So, as you can see, it's not, interestingly, not a continuous occupation. We have some gaps. So after the Chalcolithic period, the early Bronze Age 1 is completely missing. I don't think it's just that we didn't dig in the right areas, because we have absolutely not even stray sherds from that period. So after a short Chalcolithic period, we have the site really starting in the early Bronze Age 2, continuing through the early Bronze Age 3, and then we have a gap again. Parts of the early Bronze Age 4 are missing, only the later half of the early Bronze Age 4 is present, and the last period that we actually have attested is the Middle Bronze Age, but only represented by a few pits and tombs. We will look at the details later during this presentation. The dates I provided, of course, are based on high precision AMS radiocarbon dates. We have a set of, I think, more than 30 dates. 10 more are currently being analyzed. So together with Tel Arqa, farther to the north, this, for the time being, forms the backbone of the absolute dating of the Lebanese early Bronze Age. Okay, so I have to admit I skipped the Chalcolithic period because we don't have any real architecture for the period yet. We have in a few spots reached the Chalcolithic layers where we have the pottery and some other finds, but we have, due to the limited area where we uncovered this period, we have no clear idea what was going on in the Chalcolithic period at the site. So the first period where we actually can present more substantial results is the early Bronze Age, and one of the surprising results that we first got in Area 1 and then later confirmed in Area 4 was that the site was fortified, and it's a quite massive fortification. So I said before that the small size of the site suggested at first that we are dealing with a village. For the presence of the fortification does not really go together with the idea that we are dealing with a village. And as you can see, the remains of the fortification are, let's say, more than just a humble perimeter wall. It's a substantial thing. Here in Area 1, the actual city wall in the back, set against the natural geology of the slope. And on the outside, we have a quite massive stairway leading up, presumably to a destroyed gate that was farther up. We have very, very similar situations in Byblos, for instance, where stairs lead up to gates that are located surprisingly high up in the walls. Here in Area 4, on the eastern side of the tell, we have, don't ask me why, but again, a city gate. So here, the actual wall, about 2.5 meters wide. Here, the gateway, which at a later stage was blocked. One, presumably rectangular or square tower here, and a massive buttress here, and a little guard chamber on the outside, and again a blocking wall. So these blocking walls probably relate to the end of the urban settlement at the end of the early Bronze Age 3. So the presence of the fortification was already somewhat puzzling. But even more striking was what we uncovered in our main excavation area, Area 2. Remember, that was the the area along these high sections. We focused our work there because these 8-meter high sections were endangered by erosion or even eventual collapse. So in order not to lose more archaeological material, we actually excavated down along the section and used the soil obtained to create a slope that will prevent further erosion of these sections. So what we got there are basically two main architectural phases. These are our phases 3 and 4. In dark gray, the remains of phase 3, the early Bronze Age 3, and in light gray, the second half of the early Bronze Age 3. So what we got there is definitely, again, not what you would expect in a village. We have densely built up occupation. For the earlier phase, for instance, we have multi-room houses separated by small streets. So one building here, another building there, street, more buildings here, and so on. So it seems that we are not dealing just with a random placing of these buildings, but they were densely built together according to a preconceived plan. Presumably that has to do with the fortification. Once you fortify a site, space inside the fortification has to be efficiently used. And that means you can't have large open spaces. The houses have to be densely clustered together, and so on. So with at least the best excavated two buildings, building 1 and building 2, as I said, we're dealing with multi-room buildings, extremely well preserved. We call that our early Bronze Age Pompeii. The walls are standing in many cases to a height of more than 2 meters. So you can actually walk through the rooms and let's say get an idea how these rooms looked like. But as wonderful as this is, it actually immediately confronted us with a problem. Many of the rooms do not have doors. Quite interesting. So here, okay, we have an entrance leading down from, let's say, the higher street level and so on, but especially here, for instance, here and so on, no doors at all. Quite strange. Were these just stupid architects? No, we think the solution is we're dealing with multi-story buildings. So what we have here are only the basements, and the rooms were entered by wooden stairs or ladders through trapdoors. That is something quite remarkable. We have further indications which let's say suggest that our idea is true. In almost all rooms we have these extremely massive column bases. They are column bases about 80 centimeters to a meter wide, serving as foundations for wooden columns, and usually a surprisingly high number of them. Here, for instance, in this room it's 6 in total. Here, in a relatively small room, presumably also 6. One is, of course, under a later wall, and so on. You don't need that massive and that many column bases just to hold up a roof. These column bases carried massive weight, and that means the upper story. We will see further proof of multi-story buildings because our friend and colleague who left us far too early, Jean-Paul Tallmann in Tel Arka, he had the fortune to excavate a burnt building of the early Bronze Age, and he has 3 stories. A basement, the first floor, the second floor, and then only the roof. We will see a section drawing of that later. So let's say, the layout of these buildings, their size, their, let's say, well-executed masonry, suggests that we're actually dealing, in these two cases, probably not with public buildings, but with kind of elite residences. They are not, let's say, they're not the ordinary, let's say, dwellings you would expect. We'll come back to this aspect. And then, although covered by the later phase, in some cases here, for instance, the Syrian tank pit allowed us in this part to go down to the earlier levels, and here we have an extremely large building that was designed in phase 3 and then continued into phase 4. From this corner to the part where it's shaved off by the bulldozer, it's 20 meters. And as the building continued farther north, and especially farther west, we are dealing with a substantial building of substantial size here. Public building, we will come back to this. So here just some comparisons. Tel Arqa, for instance, let's say very, very similar architecture. Note the pillar bases, same as ours. Here, Saida, for instance, stone mortar set into the floor, pillar bases everywhere, and so on. And here we have this collapsed building from Tel Arqa, where we have ground floor, first floor, second floor, and then the outer wall, in this case of mud brick, covering everything. So that is the clearest proof that multi-story buildings existed already in the Bronze Age, and that, of course, has far-reaching implications. Many archaeologists have addressed the problem of how many people actually lived in these early urban centers, and if you assume just one-story buildings, you come up with surprisingly low numbers of inhabitants. And I always wonder, how can, let's say for an 8-hectare site, some 800, 900 people are postulated and so on. If you subtract, let's say, elderly people, children and so on, how can, let's say, 200, 300 adults build all these things, fortification walls, public buildings, and so on? So I think the answer really lies in these multi-story buildings, because there, on the same floor space, you can accommodate so many more people in the same space. So that, I think, will probably be a solution to these questions, to this problem of the rather low number of inhabitants for these early urban sites. Okay, so inside the buildings we found the usual range of artifacts, pottery, and various tools that suggest domestic activities, so mainly activities concerned with food storage, food preparation, food consumption, and so on. Note, for instance, this interesting thing, a 4-spouted lamp. Traditionally, that is seen as a typical early Bronze Age 4 type. In Lebanon, these start surprisingly early. Okay, the same picture again. But here I want to focus more on the later phase, the light gray phase. At some point around, according to the radiocarbon dates, 2700, 2600 BC, a major change occurred at the site. And we have no indication that this was due to a destruction or whatsoever. The older buildings were deliberately abandoned and filled in. That actually explains the extremely good preservation let's say, if a building is just abandoned and left to decay, the walls will collapse. If you deliberately fill the buildings in, that's why here we have these 2.5 meter high walls. So buildings were abandoned and a new building was erected on top of them. And that's what we refer to as our columned hall. It is a very interesting building, quite large, 8 by 6 meters, and originally it had 15 column bases, a row of 5 here, a row of originally 5, 1 column base is missing, and another row of 5 here, again with 1 missing column base. So here you see the photo, the aerial photo. So this is a quite impressive building. And in contrast to these earlier buildings, this is definitely not a domestic structure. It's a one-room building, one very large room. We have found no evidence of any daily domestic activities, so this was a special building. Unfortunately, unlike the earlier phase, we found very, very little in situ material here, but we do not suspect that this has any cultic function. There is no evidence that it was used for religious activities, so we think it's a administrative or representative building. Interestingly, we have the same problem as before. These walls are not preserved to a height of 2.5 meters, but at least 1 meter or something. And again, we have no door. We walked around the entire building, no doors. So again, we postulate that this is just the basement, these rows of columns supporting an upper story, and the access to this main upper story was via a wooden stair or something like that. That brings us to the large building farther to the west, which we called Building 4. Here we have clear evidence for at least one upper story, because here we found a surprisingly well-built staircase. So such a staircase you do not construct just to enter on your roof, that you build to efficiently use an upper story. So in this case we have, let's say, unfortunately not the complete plan, but enough. 6 rooms have been totally or partially uncovered, and in this case we can clearly say this is not an ordinary domestic structure. This is a large building which probably had some public function. We have a corridor-like situation here with a stairwell. Here we have evidence of food preparation on a quite large scale, not just for an ordinary household. And especially in these northern 3 rooms, we have evidence of massive storage installations, built-in bins in the floor, which serve to store large amounts of foodstuffs. Phytolith and botanical analysis suggest mainly grain, for instance. So, let's say large-scale storage activities took place here. These column halls are not unknown in Lebanon and the Levant. We have very, very similar structures in Byblos, for instance. Even the dimensions and the layout, 3 rows of columns here, and so on, are almost identical. The only difference is, in Byblos, they are always incorporated in large multi-room complexes, whereas our column hall is clearly freestanding. As I said, the excavation methodology of Dunant unfortunately gives no answers as to the function of these buildings here. One thing that, of course, readily springs to mind when talking about, let's say, public buildings and so on, is what were these used for? Administrative purposes and so on readily spring to mind. And for administration, of course, in the Near East, seals play a great role. We do know that in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, and so on, seals were used to, let's say, mark property, to mark, to seal goods, and so on. I just, over there in the showcase, for instance, the Aslan Tepekletule, and so on, are a good example of that. So we were quite pleased that at our site of Fadous-Kfarabida, we have evidence for the use of seals. And it's these cylinder seal impressions that you generally find on the shoulders of large storage jars. However, there is a considerable debate going on whether these cylinder seal impressions on pottery vessels really can be connected with administrative purposes, because the seal impressions were done before firing the vessels. I don't have the time to go into all the details of this debate. Nevertheless, I think we convincingly can show that these seal impressions on pottery vessels are more than mere decoration. Many of the seal impressions are not very well executed, are done in a rather sloppy way, and so on. So for decorative purposes, it doesn't really make sense. So for the time being, let's at least tentatively assume that these seals are connected with some not properly understood administrative purposes yet. We have different motives, ranging from very, very simple geometric motives like the net pattern to rather elaborate and well-carved seals depicting animals, lions, the motive of a lion attacking an upside-down goat is quite common, and interestingly we have exactly the same motives in biblos, for instance. And there is more. One of our cylinder seal impressions on pottery has an exact counterpart in biblos. I wouldn't trust the old drawing too much, but I think the photos show my point rather well. So this is a quite interesting observation. So far we have very, very few cases where we can prove that the same seal was used at different sites. And wherever that is the case, scholars have strongly argued that that this testifies to economic, political, social connections between the two sides. So this, of course, opens up a number of very, very interesting questions. So let's say if we have the same seal being used at Byblos and at Fadous-Kfarabida, does that suggest these connections? I think yes. Keep in mind that both sites are only 12 kilometers apart. Byblos, with, in the early Bronze Age, 5 hectares, is clearly the dominant site. It also was the important harbor site. So we will come back to this. This certainly, as I said, opens up avenues for studying, let's say, the socio-economic relations between Byblos and Fadous-Kfarabida, and maybe the region, a larger region around these sites. So far, cylinder seal impressions have not been well studied in Lebanon. We have, let's say, a lot of studies for the southern Levant, starting with the seminal work of Amnon Ben-Tor and others, and so on. We have the cylinder seal impressions of Syria, especially Ebla, of course, Hama also springs to mind. The studies of Stefania Mazzoni have clearly shown the importance of glyptic finds there. And Lebanon, in the middle, was always a gray area. People knew about the cylinder seal impressions from Byblos, but the stratigraphic problems associated with these excavations have led to the fact that the Byblos impressions were largely ignored. Now we have, since a couple of years, new evidence. Fadous-Kfarabida was just mentioned. Tel has produced exciting evidence. One of the spectacular finds is a completely preserved jar with, interestingly, not one, but two cylinder seal impressions, the geometric one on the shoulder and the one featuring the lion and the goat on the base. What that means, we do not really know. And we have a Sidon, for instance, where Claude de Messerhal's excavation have produced, I think, up to now more than 60 cylinder seal impressions. So Lebanon is gradually emerging as a glyptic province in its own right. And that actually also helps to clarify problems associated with some old finds. We have, for instance, here these jars from Egypt, from Giza, from the necropolis surrounding the pyramids. Reisner, who excavated these jars in the 1930s, I believe, clearly recognized that they were not Egyptian, but that they were Levantine imports. And one of these jars has a cylinder seal impression on the shoulder. So these jars, now with the help of the new glyptic evidence from Lebanon and also through petrographic studies, can be shown to be imports to Egypt from the Lebanese coast, not from the southern Levant as was previously assumed. Because there's one interesting observation here. These storage or transport jars that are typical for the early Bronze Age 2-3 differ slightly. In the southern part of the southern Levant, we always have these ledge handles, here illustrated by a jar from Jumeirah, east of the Dead Sea, whereas in the north, in Lebanon, but also Galilee, northern part of Jordan, and so on, you have these typical loop handles. Batrawi, I believe, is just on the border because you have both. You have ledge handles and loop handles. Zerakon, already just a bit farther north, has only loop handles, no ledge handles anymore. So this clearly also suggests that these Giza jars must come from the Lebanese coast, or let's say what we now start to define as the central Levant. Okay, speaking of glyptic evidence from the early Bronze Age, we mainly know early Bronze Age glyptics through these impressions on pottery vessels. There are so far only a handful of actual cylinder seals, which has led a number of scholars, starting with Amnon Mentor, to postulate that these actual cylinders were probably carved out of wood and have decayed in the meantime. So, in 2011, I was therefore very pleased when one of my students came and said, "Sir, I found something." And he had found a cylinder seal. And then we found another one, and another one, and another one, and another one. And I was really, really starting to begin suspicious. Are the students playing a trick on me here? But no, I checked everything, and so we have actually 9 cylinder seals. One is a tiny fragment that I didn't show, but so this is what we actually have. And the fact that the students didn't play a trick, they would have bought Mesopotamian cylinder seals or something, as the local glyptics are virtually unknown. So this is a genuine collection, and actually if you dig through the Biblos, the massive Biblos publications, you find similar things there, but let's say otherwise, such cylinder seals are largely unknown. So what do we actually have? We have a surprisingly wide range of materials. This one is terracotta, fire clay, limestone, ivory, hippopotamus ivory according to our zoologist, a stone, I forgot which one, bone, ivory again, bone, and another ivory seal. So 3 ivory seals, where the tiny fragment is antler. So a quite remarkable collection, and some of these seals, especially onyx, especially the ivory seals and the onyx seals, are made out of, let's say, valuable materials. That's one thing. The second thing is that the motifs that are shown on these seals, strangely, are very different from what we see on the impressions. On the impressions we have largely geometric motifs, or the lion and the goat. Here, on the seals, we have a much wider variety of materials. We have some unclear tetbesh animals. We have a beautiful lion that actually turns into a goat in a tetbesh manner, but never attested on the actual impressions. Onyx is a very hard stone, so here are just some lines, unclear. A hunting scene, person either attacking a lion with a spear or defending himself against a lion with a spear and so on. This is a unique depiction so far. We have a standing human brandishing a curved object. The first representation of the smiting god that we have later on in the 2nd millennium, Baal brandishing a weapon. I do not believe so, because the curved swords are somewhat later, only attested from the Middle Bronze Age onwards in our region, and the strong curvature suggests rather a sickle or something, so maybe an agricultural god or whatever. I don't have the time to go into speculations here. This little seal is extremely exciting, not because of the motive it shows, but this is an unfinished seal. So somebody started to carve a lion, but here the perforation is not executed, the details of the decoration are missing, and so on. So this is something extremely fascinating, whereas the finished seals could be carved anywhere. They're easily portable, just the size of a battery, and these little loops make them ideal for carrying them around the neck on a string or something. So these could have been carved anywhere and ended up at our site, God knows why. But nobody will carry around an unfinished seal. So that is evidence for local production. Quite interesting. This one is also quite interesting, this ivory seal. It has a number of small motifs which at first sight look like little stylized palm trees, but I believe them to be ram's head depictions, and these ram's heads we find again as applications on pottery. Again, Stefania Mazzoni has already 30 years ago written still, I think, the groundbreaking article on these depictions, so that actually adds new evidence to her theory that these ram's heads applications on pottery vessels are also markings used for administrative trade purposes and so on. So, a rather fascinating collection of seals from this admittedly small site. I was just mentioning the ram's heads applications. Here they are, one from our site, one from Tell Fadous-Kfarabida, we have them from Byblos, and, hey presto, on an imported vessel from Egypt again, the little ram's head directly on the shoulder, so that's the distribution of the ram's heads so far. There is one from Batrawi, I have to add that for my next presentation. Anyway, the interesting thing is these ram's heads applications really cluster again in the central Levant and are exported from there to Egypt. One other, I can say, remarkable discovery was made in 2009. We immediately washed the animal bones on the excavation and so on. That gives us the opportunity to immediately extract any worked bones and so on. So while washing the bones, we came first across half of this thing, and it had these perforations, so I thought, spacer bead or something like that. Then, while washing the next batch, the second half of this object came. So it is a bar-shaped object, just 10 centimeters long, with perforations at both ends, and a perforation in the middle. One actually was not fully finished, because it is not in the point of equilibrium, so a second perforation then balanced the thing completely. So we are dealing with a scale beam for weighing things. And that is absolutely fascinating, because that is, to the best of our knowledge, the first scale beam, the oldest scale beam in the Levant. We have similar things from early Bronze Age Anatolia and the Aegean, also in the same size range, 12, 10 centimeters and so on. So these are scales for weighing small quantities of precious commodities. Gold, silver, spices, drugs readily spring to mind and so on. We do have, from other sites, weights, for instance. Ebla has produced a good number of weights, Byblos as well, and so on. So that means the concept of weighing things developed in the first half of the third millennium in this region. And that, again, suggests complex trade transactions. It's not just, let's say, a barter system, let's say, one bag of grain against one sheep or so. It means that things were really quantified. We do know from Mesopotamian texts that silver was already used as a currency, but not yet standardized, so that's why the quantities had to be weighed. And that means the Lebanese coast was part of this system. Further things that we have, I already alluded to relations with Egypt. So the central Levantine coast sends jars, presumably filled with agricultural goods, oil, wine, tree resin or something, to Egypt. What did the Egyptians send back? Luxury objects. Byblos has produced a remarkable collection of stone vessels, for instance, sometimes even with royal inscriptions mentioning pharaohs from the 2nd to the 6th dynasty and so on. So we have so far one little sherd of a bowl, unfortunately without inscription, but nevertheless the stone stands out as something peculiar, and when I took it to AUB and showed it our geology professor there, who happens to be an Egyptian, he immediately said, "This is from home. This is porphyritic rhyolite, which comes from the eastern desert in Egypt and is not attested in Lebanon at all." Then we have another interesting object, a handle with an impression which unfortunately is one of these very sloppy impressions, but the motives clearly differ from what we have otherwise attested at the site. It's not the geometric patterns, the net pattern, it's not the lion and goat motif, it's a lot of, let's say, finely small individual signs and so on. So I started to show it to Egyptologists because to me it looked like hieroglyphs, and yes, 3 Egyptologists have confirmed, yes, there are hieroglyphs, but due to the fact that they are very, very, let's say, eroded and weathered and so on, we cannot read the text, but clearly this is either an impression of an Egyptian or an Egyptianizing seal. The interesting thing is the clay of the handle is local, so it's not the jar itself that's an import, but somebody either brought a cylinder seal from Egypt or manufactured a cylinder seal according to an Egyptian style and used it at the site. Okay, I have postulated that the cylinder seal impressions and the cylinder seals are maybe signs of, let's say, a developed complex administration. And interestingly, the distribution of especially the cylinder seals seems to support that. Here are our 9 cylinder seals, and hey presto, they are only restricted to the 2 buildings that where we, according to the size and the layout, already said these are special buildings, administrative, elite, connected, or something like that. So they don't show up in the earlier domestic dwellings, they never show up in the other areas and so on. With the actual impressions, it's different. They are distributed over the entire site. And this reminds me of one other thing. These, what we call public buildings, clearly are built in a way to create, let's say, visual effects, for instance. Certainly these rows of columns are meant to impress visitors, and interestingly, all the corners of these public buildings are made with very well-dressed large stones, sometimes exceeding a meter in length and so on, whereas the normal walls are with undressed limestones. So for the corners, for stability and presumably visual effects, well-dressed stones were used, and we have the large hammers, which probably were used for the stone dressing. I see that I need to speed up. So, the function of the site. The architecture clearly shows that we're not dealing with a village here, but with some kind of small urban community. And interestingly, the botanical remains suggest that as well. In most village communities, you will have a mixed economy, that people produce a little bit of everything for security reasons, to have a wide range of food supplies at hand and so on. This is not the picture that we have for Fadous-Kfarabida. What we have is large-scale production of just 2, what can be called cash crops. Emmer wheat, more than 40%, olive, more than 40%, the rest you can forget. Barley, grape, wild plants hardly play any role, lentils and so on. So this is evidence for a specialized production, and that means the settlement has to be tied in a larger economic system. So we assume for the time being that the site either produces or maybe even collects from the wider region, let's say, high-quality agricultural goods that are sent on to a central site, Byblos, presumably. Byblos had the harbor facility and probably used partly these goods for their own population, but also exported them. I don't have the time to go into the animal use right now, but one interesting remark, except for marine species, we have almost no wild animals. So that suggests hunting did not play a role, or maybe due to the intensive use of the landscape around the site, there were hardly any wild animals left. Just to show our botanical spectrum in comparison with other sites from the Levant. So, I mean, here Bechean, for instance, that is a clear sign of a mixed economy and so on. But what I find extremely interesting is that Fadous-Kfarabida compares extremely well with the evidence from Tell Yarmout. And in Tell Yarmout there is this massive palace, and I haven't talked to Pierre Lemerocheville recently. At some point he just said, Hermann, you don't have a palace, I have a palace. But I think with this I can, let's say, make my point, my arguments a bit stronger. So where does that leave us for the settlement system of the early Bronze Age 2-3? Unfortunately, we are just starting to get regional surveys here. So this picture of, let's say, early Bronze Age sites on the central Lebanese coast is clearly incomplete, but one thing is quite clear. Byblos seems to be the only substantial site of a substantial size. I said 5 hectares. For Lebanese standards, that is quite big. All the other sites that we have here are considerably smaller. Now, as soon as we go north of Ras Shaka or south of Beirut, we suddenly get lots of large sites. So why don't we have large sites here? 2 explanations. Maybe these large sites have been destroyed. Unlikely, because we have accounts of earlier travelers from the 1920s, 1930s, and so on. They all mention Byblos, nobody mentions any other site. The other point is that Byblos indeed was the only site, and that means it controlled the coast. And interestingly, north at Ras Shaka and south at Ras El Khelb, we have natural borders. So it could be that Byblos actually controlled this region, and sites like Kfarabida, like Kuba, and so on were satellite settlements linked economically and politically to Byblos, maybe collecting these foodstuffs and so on. So in that case, we would actually have more than just a city-state. We would, I think I used the term once, a kind of proto-territorial state. Maybe we need more evidence for that. So, moving on in time, I said after the early Bronze Age 3, which now ends, according to the radiocarbon dates, around 2500 BC, we first have a gap. And when we see activities again in the early Bronze Age 4B, material that's being worked on by Marta, we have a completely different picture. The early Bronze Age 4B is largely represented by pits. Hardly any architectural evidence. We have, in some cases, in this room, evidence of reuse of the older structures, but no substantial building activities. And here, for instance, you can beautifully see how this early Bronze Age 4 pit cuts into the earlier architecture. So, what happened here? This pit phase suggests maybe some squatter occupation, some just random people living there, but one of the interesting things is what we actually get from the pits is high-quality pottery and a very specialized assemblage, largely dominated by fancy drinking vessels, jugs, and so on. We have even some nice metal finds like this bronze pin and so on. So, what happened here? This is not the leftover of some shepherds camping at the site. let's say the concentration of especially fancy drinking vessels suggests maybe some ritual feasting or something. I know that these theories have become increasingly popular in the recent years. Everybody has ritual feasting, but how to explain this rather unusual pottery assemblage otherwise? That the site actually was not completely isolated in the early Bronze Age 4 is borne out by one other interesting find, unfortunately from a topsoil context, a seal impression, but a very different seal impression from what we've seen before. The early Bronze Age 3 seal impressions are always on the shoulders of transport jars. Here we have an impression on the rim of a cooking pot. And these impressions on cooking pots, on the rims of cooking pots, are of course extremely well known from Ebla, from Hama, and from other sites in western central Syria. So here we have the distribution of these very typical impressions for the early Bronze Age 4, and it seems that Fadous-Kfarabida, for the time being, is the southernmost extension of the distribution of this specialized group of cylinder seal impressions. So clearly, despite the pit phase only, the site still has some connections to the outside world. And lastly, we come to our last occupational phase, the Middle Bronze Age. The picture, interestingly, is the same. We have no architecture, we just have pits, but this time also accompanied by burials. So here, the Middle Bronze Age pits, some of them actually remarkably well done, with, let's say, a nice stone lining and so on. Here, Natalie emptying a pit. Others are just simple, let's say, irregular pits dug into the soil, but with, in some cases, complete vessels. The burials, for instance, here our first burial that we excavated 2007-2008, and let's say individual buried on its back with a quite nice assemblage of Middle Bronze Age pottery, a nice Tel Fadous juglet accompanying him. I think it's a him, yeah. And interestingly is this bowl, which was deposited in the tomb in a damaged state, right on top of the skull, and soot marks indicate that this vessel was used as a lamp. Here a second burial, in this case a woman with a stone circle around the tomb and so on. Again, a nice assemblage of pottery vessels. Again, one Tel Fadous juglet, and just a small story that was found in 2010. Of course, in the last week of excavations, I was very unhappy. Burials take time and so on. So everywhere else work had already stopped. On the very last day, we still have to take out the bones. And I remember telling my wife, oh yeah, successful excavation season, but we didn't really find something with a wow effect. So on the very last day, when we take out the bones, on one of the fingers of the left hand, we found this scarab. So let's say a moderately wealthy tomb. There are some other interesting aspects here. This is the femur, the right femur, and our anthropologist noticed a rather nasty fracture there, but a fracture that had healed. So these femur fractures do not just heal by themselves. That means really, let's say, reconnecting the bones, bandaging, stabilizing, and so on. So that means already in the Middle Bronze Age, people must have had a surprisingly good medical knowledge. Dental hygiene is, on the other hand, a severe problem. First, that's the jaw. of this 40-year-old lady, and you can see already during her lifetime she had lost more than half of her teeth. Among the Middle Bronze Age pottery assemblage, we noticed some objects, some sherds, which clearly looked not right somehow. We puzzled, what are these, and so on, and it took a visit from Karin Kopetsky, who extensively worked in Tel Fadous, to tell us, hey, you have Egyptian imports. So we have, I think, despite the small size of the settlement, we have so far 25 different vessels from Egypt, and interestingly, we have not only the typical storage or transport jars, but vessels related to food preparation. A large cooking pot, a spouted bowl used for food preparation. What that means, we don't know yet, but it could be that locals were preparing food according to Egyptian fashion, or could it mean that Egyptians were living there? Again, questions. So, as you all know, archaeology can only prosper when we have times of stability. Lebanon is a country that's plagued by, let's say, frequent instability. Fortunately, the last almost 10 years were remarkably quiet, and we hope that this guy does not come back in 5 minutes. Of course, what I presented here is not my own work. It's the work of a large team of excavators, of various people analyzing various group of finds and so on. So just to give an idea about the teams and their size, we actually always worked in relatively small groups and without workmen. I think the teams have done an absolutely wonderful work, and of course we work with the support of the Direction Générale des Antiquités in Lebanon. Financial support is being provided by the American University of Beirut and various other institutions. I've talked for far too long again, and
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I'm of course very happy about the content of your presentation, because I'm happy that you have found a city, a palace, all things that sometimes in Levant are some ephemeral things. So you have provided with these incredible discoveries, which are actually normal, I think, in such kind of sites. The proofs that there was a low density urban model, which is not always, not at all the same of other areas. Or if we don't like the terminology urban and city, which perhaps is not completely fitting this, you have described a nice, let's say, phenomenon which is shared in many areas, such as Batrahawi and Tel Sultan. And it's amazing the comparisons of the evidence of the cylinder seals, which is a very strong evidence. Even if we have also, what is amazing is that the impressions are different from the seals, so you have double.
Yes, that is a problem.
And it's not a problem, it's very interesting. And because I was worried when I saw the seals, because we found once a wooden seal in Batrahawi. And the idea is that that kind of seals of the, let's say, central administration were carved into wood, for example, olive wood or some strong wood. And so you have found other kinds of
So maybe
female seals.
we have maybe two different systems of seal use. One, the wooden ones, actually for impressing the pottery, and the actual seals we
There are
found
many
maybe for other purposes.
There are many interesting discoveries, like the balance beam.
Yes,
This is another positive answer to the hundreds of weights or small weights that where we are finding since many years. Always stating that it was a system for metals, but this is really an incredible. So thank you. I think it's full of insights. This presentation for people studying the low density urban system of the Levant, and many other suggestions now are in my mind. Concerning the feast, I would just call it the picnic on the terrace.
Maybe
before.
Who knows? Yeah.
And I don't know.
But they're very thin-walled vessels in many cases, so you can't just pack them up in a big basket.
Very delicate. So I apologize for because I could not refrain from this reaction, but of course I have to ask to the audience if you have some questions or comments for Professor Genz, that we thank again for this very convincing. Of course, we need, of course, the tablet at the end. Yes,
the Apple tablet. That's still missing.
You don't need.
No? Okay.
But could they write or not at the end, or perhaps they write just on papyrus?
We don't know.
Qualcuno vuole fare una domanda o un commento? Il professor Panzetti dice qualcosa?
Well, I could have an answer, a question about the last part of the lecture. That is, so you think that in the last period you shift in dominance or in connections with Syria, with all this central part of Lebanon?
Yes. So what is interesting, let's say in the early Bronze Age 3, for instance, the site is clearly looking south. We have, let's say, almost all parallels with the southern Levant, Egypt, and so on. In the early Bronze Age 4, we suddenly see a much stronger northern connection with our Ebla-Hama type seal impression, with some of the pottery types that appear completely new in the early Bronze Age 4 and so on. So there seems to be, let's say, a reorientation, maybe because in the southern Levant the collapse was more severe.
But at the same time it is the period when you have the Egyptian...
No, that the Egyptian ceramic imports, that's the Middle Bronze Age. That's the beginning, that's the beginning.
So in the Middle Bronze Age you think it changed again?
Yes. There we are again looking south, interestingly. In Tel Arka, for instance, the Middle Bronze Age pottery looks very different. That's looking north to Syria. We are looking south to, let's say, the southern Levant, Egypt, and so on. And Fadous-Kfarabida and Arka are only 50 kilometers apart. But
and you can think that maybe there is some administration?
In the Middle Bronze Age, not at our site. We do know that Byblos, of course, is an important center for trade with Egypt in the Middle Bronze Age. We have other, let's say, even larger urban centers. My next project, Hermann, has a Middle Bronze Age rampart fortification and had a size of up to 6 hectares, probably. But we are just at the beginning, so I can't say much.
For the next
Yes.
So, thank you very much for coming here and for your stay in Rome, and good luck for the future project.
So I have to thank all of you. As I said, you made me feel very welcome here.